So this is going to be a big one. For those of you who followed the channel for the past few months, you'll know that I've streamed Red Dead Redemption 2 for about 2.5 months, and for those of you who watched my playthrough from the beginning, those of you who found the channel through the playthrough, midway through the playthrough, etc. First thing I want to say in this review is thank you. Honestly, it wouldn't be possible for me to play through the game start to finish in the way that I did without different people across different platforms checking out the shorts, checking out and going ahead and subscribing, watching the other videos. Even if you came into the chat once and said like 2 words, I just have to thank you too, because me going through this journey and unpacking and being able to do this 100-hour experience 6 years after the game released quite literally wouldn't be possible for me if there weren't for the people there to support, troll, help, or just talk. That's the first thing. Now, I do want to give a bit of background for those of you who don't know my experience with Red Dead Redemption as like, I guess you could say, a series or franchise. So I'd played about 1 or 2 hours of Red Dead Redemption 1 before playing Red Dead Redemption 2. So it was a very limited experience in terms of what I knew about the series in a larger sense. Of course, the stuff like it's a Western game, has cowboys, outlaws, and the like, but that's just a very basic look at it. It's like saying you know Star Wars because it has spaceships. I did, however, have a few friends who had played the first game and talked to me about some of the basics and a bit of the Easter eggs, like the
name of all the traits are you talking about, human?
You eat babies.
So essentially that was my knowledge and experience going into Red Dead Redemption 2 for the first time. Now finally, and most importantly, I want to talk to you about the structure of this review, because this is a very different style of Total Classics that I'm trying for the first time. You'll notice that in the video title and in the thumbnail it says part 1 to the whole review. What this means is I'll primarily refrain from talking main spoilers in this part of the review. I'll give some background on the story, some characters, and some other aspects in the next section, but beyond that, other than some gameplay footage, you won't really notice any potential story spoilers. Now, I will have spoilers for certain side missions and side content. This first part of the review will focus on gameplay aspects, primarily with the side content. The second part of the review, which will come out at a later date, I'm not sure, will focus on the story and kind of the themes there that I really enjoyed, because I really think that the story is a core part of the experience, and if you don't know the story and if you don't understand it in the same kind of way or in a proper kind of way, then I don't think you can really appreciate how great a game this is. And I think just having a section in this review and just calling it a day wouldn't do the story justice, because it is that core part of the experience. So I know this is kind of a shake-up to how we usually do it. Literally in the last review, the Elden Ring Twitter Classics, we had Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree in one review. I want to test this format out and see if it works, and if it does, people like it, I'll do it some more. If it doesn't, at least you tried it. Usual disclaimer, I played Red Dead Redemption 2 on the Xbox Series X, and we'll talk about it in the context of me doing so. Any performance or glitch type issues may differ for others. I will try to indicate when I talk spoilers, but beware that footage may be considered spoiler heavy. I also streamed my gameplay of Red Dead Redemption 2 on this channel, so if you'd like to watch the whole thing, literally just check the VODs playlist, or if it's not there, check the live feed. Anyways, without further deliberation, let's get into the review. So as I was saying, I wanted to give some background and set up the story of the review without spoiling too much. Red Dead Redemption 2 is split across 6 chapters and 2 parts of an epilogue. In the game, you follow the Van der Linde gang after an off-screen but crucial event called the Blackwater Massacre, which they participated in, where the gang were able to obtain a large stash of money that is hidden in that area but they can't return to get, since they're wanted dead or alive by the law because of the events of such an incident. You play as a character, Arthur Morgan, who I believe had been with the gang for about 15 years and is a high-ranking member of the Van der Linde gang. The events of the Blackwater Massacre seem to do a hefty blow to the gang, despite them getting the money and being able to stash it somewhere known only to 2 characters in the gang, the leader, Dutch Van der Linde, and Hosea Matthews, who is another senior member of the gang. They were left in an unwinnable situation where more than a few members were either dead, injured, or captured. The looming mystery of the event serves as a sufficient backdrop for the game to take place, as due to it, the gang are forced north into the mountains, where chapter 1 of our story begins. Again, this is just to give some setup to the story, so I won't say much more outside of a few thematic tidbits. A crucial aspect of Red Dead Redemption 2 is its historical setting. The year's 1899, time when the untamed Wild West was being replaced with the civilized world. Railroads, telegraphs, and industrialization spread across the American frontier, bringing order but also stifling the freedoms once associated with the West. Law enforcement agencies like the Pinkerton Detect Agency aggressively pursued outlaws, and reflecting a growing institutionalization of power. This was a period of transition, the death of the frontier and the rise of bureaucracy, industrial might, and a new societal structure where only those deemed legitimate by the government could use force to maintain control. This tension lies at the heart of the game's story, as the Vandalin gang struggles to survive in a world which no longer has a place for them. As the player, you really feel the struggle displayed throughout the story, especially through Dutch and other high-ranking members of the gang in particular. But even amongst regular conversations and background characters, it becomes very clear that this is the end of the road for this way of life, and many of them cannot adapt to it. I think that's enough background and setup without getting too deep into the analysis of the story, as that would lead to story spoilers, so I'll leave it there, and the rest of my thoughts will be on the main story. Characters, themes, and moments will be left for part 2. Thank you. Moving on from background to more of the aesthetic and actual graphics of the game. First, I was stunned at how good the game looked for a game that is 6 years old. It isn't really touched by games even today. If you take the whole package as an experience, the graphics, aesthetic, immersion wise, I don't think anything touches it, even a whole generation later. The game definitely has that realistic aesthetic that really elevates the experience and enhances the immersion. What I mean by immersion, and I'll get more into this later, essentially those little details and quality that exist within the game that you might not appreciate in a vacuum, but if they're emphasized and taken advantage of, can really enhance the experience and make you feel like you're living in the world. A basic example of this that's very common in games now is footprints. A small detail that a lot of people now would just discard. But again, this doesn't just exist in a vacuum. So footprints in the snow and now have more of an impact when you see them. Your horse riding through snow, the way the snow parts at each step, rain might come after, fill those footprints up with water. All of these things in a vacuum you can isolate and maybe simple things to implement in comparison to the scale of the game. You add all of these things in and then you let the player find these things themselves and discover these little microsystems working in tandem in the background that they might never have appreciated but still exist regardless if they go unappreciated. Just like real life, the world does not revolve around what we immediately see and do. Just like every little thing in life is a cog in the machine that makes the world go round, all these little things contribute to the overall immersion of the game. But that's enough about the immersion in this section. Let me get back to aesthetic. So beyond being realistic, as we just spoke about at length, this game is still a western by nature, and westerns have a very distinct aesthetic in terms of the worlds that are crafted, the lighting, the colors, etc. We'll get more into the world in the next section, but in terms of just a very basic conversation about how the world complements the aesthetic, there are many towns and cities, or even just smaller homesteads or farms that clearly convey the style and hold a western tone, even down to a basic level. And even the most modern of cities in Saint-Denis, it still has that touch of that charm. Color, I feel like, is a very important thing when discussing the aesthetic, and this is a very important way westerns, and by extension Red Dead Redemption 2, convey meaning and influence you as the player in this case. For example, the different tones and colors from warm to cold tones, you can definitely feel what they're trying to do when using these two different ends of the spectrum. I'd say in a lot of cases throughout the game, such as the majority of your time in the town of Rhodes during the story, which is the best use of this type of tone without getting into explicit spoilers later down the line, you feel the warm oranges, the reds, the golden hues that surround this settlement that attempt to mask the ugly scars of the Civil War. You can say that this tone can be used to hold and convey many meanings, such as nostalgia towards a better time, the grandeur of the American frontier, the last holdout before the coming industrialization. It could also hint towards darker themes too. Instead of nostalgia, you could say history, as in the history of a long and bloody history between the two feuding families that the town revolves around. When it comes to colder tones, I think it's much easier to indicate what they're trying to specifically convey to you in the moment. For example, north of the map in Umbarino, around Mount Hagen and Coulter, the feeling of isolation, nearly suffocating in its intensity, especially in the crafted story moments, definitely feels like the entire world is against you here in the ice and snow. No foothold of civilization established, but then again, nothing that wants to be found is established in these areas. All are either secretive, desperate, or isolated here. I think the use of this is actually very interesting from a narrative perspective, but I'll have to say my thoughts again for part 2. Before moving on to the graphics in more detail, I do want to talk about the lighting. The lighting throughout the game is impeccable, especially for a game, again, released in a generation without ray tracing. I believe it still doesn't even have ray tracing built into the game on console or PC, from my understanding. Regardless, there are many areas throughout the game that really utilize lighting in a unique and interesting way. I'll give 2 examples of instances of this. One instance is the camp with the gang at night. The warm glow of the campfires with a few gang members go around telling stories that create respite in the darkness, a beacon in the night, a small cozy moment in the ultimately bleak reality that the gang faces. Another moment of the lighting being used well is again in Saint-Denis, at night in particular. Walking through the cobbled streets of the city, pavement underfoot, and glaring streetlights above, creating the orange spots of light illuminating the city. Now, before we move on to the world, I want to speak about the graphics a bit more in terms of the character models. I have a whole section on NPCs, so I'll get onto that later, but I just wanted to appreciate how good the facial expressions are in the game. In any given cutscene, you can just really zoom into a character's face and it will really reveal a lot to you about that character. And if you're able to dissect both the tone in terms of voice acting and actual facial expressions they're making, because they've done such a good job, then it's easier to go on and understand what that character is feeling on a human level. Again, this is something that I have to talk about story specifics in part 2. Now, onto the world of Red Dead Redemption 2. The game takes place across 5 fictional states and a bit beyond, but I'll get onto that in part 2. If you know, you know. West Elizabeth, New Austin, Lemoyne, Hanover, and Ambarino. As previously stated, the game takes place across these 5 states, which are really supposed to be, in my opinion, a hyper-condensed version of America, representing a large variety of biomes in a much smaller space than if they were to actually be the states that they represent. New Austin is clearly supposed to be inspired by Texas and New Mexico, Lemoyne inspired by Mississippi and Louisiana, Ambarino, from what I understand, is supposed to be somewhat inspired by Colorado, obviously Saint-Denis, very inspired by New Orleans, etc. You could look deeper into other states, and to be honest, I'm not an expert on the geography of the United States, so I'll refrain from stating more than just the obvious ones. I'd say I like this decision because it takes a lot of different types of biomes, such as swamps, deserts, plains, mountains, forests, canyons, etc., all condense them down into one map. As if it was more realistic in this aspect, it would obviously take months to travel between states, which just wouldn't be as good as the condensed, gamified, inspired versions of the states that we get in game, which are very sizable with stuff that we care about in the game. Now, talking about the different towns and cities throughout the game, I'll give my thoughts on each one of them. This will be talking about all the towns, by the way, so this will contain spoilers. If you don't want to hear about every town, then please skip to the next section. Okay, so first I'll talk about the second best town for me, Valentine, which I think is the best in terms of a western-like town. It has that main town type of feel to it, where you'll be going for a lot of the game. Since it has a lot of vendors that other towns might not have, Valentine essentially has everything you basically need, except for some specific vendors, the dirt streets, the saloons, the drunken brawls, the duels, the wooden storefronts really push that western feel in Valentine and sets a good baseline for later towns to meet. Now, we already talked a decent amount about Rhodes, but basically just to quickly reiterate, it has that feeling that there's a lot of history there. Without giving its full story straight away, it's a smaller, more quaint town with arguably a more distinct western feel than Valentine due to it being more desert-y. Maybe one could argue that it gives that western style and charm more, but I'd say in terms of a complete package, Valentine fits the mold better. Rhodes has this feel to it. Once you notice it, you can't really distinguish if it's tranquility and peace from it being a small town, or, and more likely, it's the tension and the underlying facade of peace between the Braithwaites and the Greys. Then moving on to Strawberry. Now for me, it's an alright town. Not really one I ever focused on, because there was never really a reason for me to go there outside of certain missions and everything that it has that you would want outside of a main mission capacity is found much closer. Strawberry feels very isolated as a town on the map for a majority of the game, despite having this more welcoming feeling. I think it's supposed to serve as that kind of pit stop, or if you want to go into the mountains of Ambarino, and that would make sense. But outside of you wanting to go to Ambarino, I just didn't see a purpose in the majority of the game to go to Rhodes. Also for me, it didn't feel as distinct as Valentine, Saint-Denis, and even Van Horn. It just felt like a normal town, which really didn't allow it to stand out to its detriment. It's not a bad town, it serves its purpose well for the majority of the game, but an okay far away town that serves as a pit stop for an area you rarely may even go to isn't going to compare to some of the other great towns in the game. However, to be fair, I think one large issue with Strawberry is that it has another function that isn't really explored or utilized until the epilogue. See, it's also the closest town to Blackwater or New Austin, so one could argue that its purpose could also be to act as a pit stop between those two sides of the map, but one side you literally don't go to until after the end of the game. It does hinder its purpose there. I naturally, in the epilogue, did find myself going to Strawberry much more, regardless of if there were story reasons to go there or not. Moving on to Van Horn, I actually did like Van Horn quite a bit, despite it not really being used at all in any real way, outside of one or two story missions and one side mission. Despite its use, it was a town I frequently frequently at least rode through to get from Saint-Denis to Ansberg and vice versa. And I have to say, I liked its tone or atmosphere. Felt like that run-down coast town run by outlaws with old broken down buildings. There's very dirty feel to it. It also had this really nice touch of not giving you a bounty if you do stuff there. Everyone in the town, it will essentially jump you if you do so. It adds that kind of outlaw fantasy. It's a stark contrast to Saint-Denis. If you commit a crime deep in Saint-Denis, you might as well give up if you aren't prepared beforehand. I feel if Van Horn was given the same treatment as Rhodes, with its more fleshed out storyline or even just more side missions, it could have at least been top 3 towns. So I do feel it's somewhat a missed opportunity in some aspects in comparison to some of the other towns such as Saint-Denis, Valentine, Rhodes, Ansberg. Even Butcher's Creek had some side missions that instantly, if Van Horn had the quality of them, would have boosted Van Horn up as a town in my opinion. Anyways, speaking of Saint-Denis, I think it is the best city in the game. As I said before, when it comes to the lighting, atmosphere, the contrast, by far it's the largest town or city in the game. That central modern civilization feeling. It has the most amount of side missions, I believe, and I probably dare to say the most important main missions happen around the city. The French architecture, the distinct different cultures that are present which aren't present throughout the rest of the game and other cities. It really shows that transition from the American frontier to the modern age. Better than people can really explain, I think. Last major town I wanted to talk about before I get into spoilers was, of course, Ansberg, which I feel is just a nice mining town. One feature I really liked about it was its extensive mining system. I accidentally found a ladder down there, and if I didn't have the map, I could have easily got lost. Ansberg, I would say, was good, a bit bigger than Van Horn in terms of what's there on the vendor level. It also has that nice train running through it, which adds that kind of feeling of it being a mining town. Now, quickly before I go into the towns only found within the epilogue, I just want to talk about a few smaller settlements or locations. I mentioned earlier Butcher's Creek, but you could also put Lagras, Holter, Wapiti Reservation, Emerald Station here, such as these are big enough to be mentioned here as fleshing out the world, adding some unique locales between the different main towns and cities. Things that the player will go towards and return for their own specialized needs. For example, Lagras is in the swamps and has the specific vendor for special baits for fishing. Butcher's Creek has a whole large side mission line behind it and has some interesting mysteries, and Wapiti is a central location for certain conflicts throughout the story. They all fit their purpose well and are large enough to be mentioned here. Now to move on to the epilogue towns quickly, obviously spoilers ahead for the final time. Blackwater is essentially the central town of the epilogue. It has a very unique feel in my eyes. A town teetering on the edge of modernization, not quite to Saint-Denis level with its urban areas, but it's not close to Valentine's western feel. It's someplace in between, in progress. You can see the buildings in progress being built, but it has the paved cobbled roads like Saint-Denis. There's also Armadillo and Tumbleweed, both from what I've heard were in Red Dead Redemption 1. I'm not sure about the significance in that game. In this, they do basically have nothing to do here. Armadillo is basically a ghost town due to a cholera outbreak, forcing many to leave in the face of dying. Tumbleweed is, however, more interesting in my opinion, because it does have some bounties over there and the sheriff is an interesting character to say the least. Now talking about more of the world's events and things in the world, random encounters, dynamic events in the game I felt were the strongest aspect in terms of not only encouraging exploration, but also disincentivizing fast travel in the game. I think this was probably the only game that I didn't think fast travel was a necessity for the majority of it. It isn't something where you're instantly going from one place to another. It's nice to go around on your horse from location to location and actually finding something on the side of the road, an NPC, perhaps a robbery, a prison, an ambush, etc. I feel like this was very important for them to do, and it's very deliberate, and it's very much the case that you will naturally need to return to some towns and cities that aren't relevant to the story but are still useful beyond being a pit stop. I say this because there's definitely games out there with towns, cities, areas even that you only go to once. You solve the problems in that place in the story and you never return to again. I don't think Red Dead Redemption 2 is like that at all. I always had the feeling to return to towns that I hadn't been to in a while to see if there's something going on there in terms of side mission, or if anything's changed, if there's an NPC who wants to interact, etc. And on those journeys back and forth, it's very nice to see these dynamic events take place in the world. These little random events strengthen two other aspects in the game in terms of world building and player agency. First thing I would say, world building, is because there's a lot of micro details about the lore, story, and undertones that you wouldn't get if a main mission explicitly would take you to do the same thing. For example, there's the Night Folk, or a group that that's only spoken about in the main story in a few lines, but from that you can't really tell anything about them, their nature, how they are, what they're about. The game could have included some forced encounters in the story with them, but at some point you can't just leave everything in the story or it'll ruin the pace for certain moments in the game. You either have to include something about them in side missions at best, included in special locations maybe, or most frequently used in random encounters or dynamic events, to really specify how these different groups and gangs are different and distinct beyond just their obvious differences as enemies. The second most important aspect, as I was saying, was the player agency and really allowing the player to act in whatever way they wanted in a situation. Don't get me wrong, there was definitely some times in the story where you get to choose to be either low on or high on, and that's a whole system unto itself, but in the main story there's only so much deviation and player freedom that can be expressed in a game like this. So in dynamic events and random encounters, you really feel like you can do whatever you want. For example, do you find some prisoner trying to escape? You can either choose to leave him, help them out, free them, kill them, recapture them, take them to some train tracks and wait for them to get hit, etc. Also, just because I'm using examples from outside in the wilderness, don't think that there isn't some good ones in the actual towns and cities too, like the standoffs between the police and the outlaws, the drunken brawls, the beggars and other situations that make the different towns distinct, and that would also world build more than the base main story of the game could allow. Now, I spoke a bit about immersion earlier, but I do want to kind of expand on that because this is one of the most immersive games in terms of all the small details one might not ever see or appreciate, but they still exist in this game. As I said before, I think immersion is really important because especially when games grow in capabilities and technology, there's a need for new priorities for these games, capabilities beyond just graphics. We're not at a ceiling for graphics, but especially now I think it's important for games to not to just look good, but to feel alive. Immersion, essentially making the game feel like it doesn't specifically revolve around you and what you're doing, are there for you to notice but will still persist beyond you noticing them, if that makes sense. Nice little touches like your horse getting more dirty as you go through mudded areas, your horse being physically affected, you're overexerting it, it's putting its head down, perhaps starting to limp some more, even something as simple as Arthur's beard growing throughout the game, and when things happen like a cut forward a few weeks, the beard getting physically longer from mission to mission. It isn't something they had to do, but it makes the game world feel alive and like time is passing by. It makes the world feel lived in, allows the player to suspend disbelief and fall into the world more. I think we've all had a moment while we're playing a game, so wrapped up in the story, the world, etc. Something comes along or something dumb happens or a detail is missing and that completely just takes you out of the experience. For some people it can make you even honestly turn away from a game. I didn't have that experience of Red Dead Redemption 2 in the closest. Now this is linked to immersion, but I wanted to kind of separate it and talk about it more on its own since I think they did a phenomenal job in terms of each NPC and their behavior. Now talking more generally on why I think they've done such a good job is there's a stark balance that has to be met, and that is between the number of NPCs in the game and how unique or specific their behaviors can be. I use Bethesda games to illustrate this. In Starfield, there's quite a lot of NPCs throughout the game, but many of them that you can see do not really have any unique behavior, just citizen, a randomized NPC walking around the city, and this is something that I was talking about earlier. It's something that really unfortunately takes you out of the experience of the game. Then you have, on the polar opposite side, you have Skyrim, and Skyrim has it so basically every NPC has some unique dialogue, quest, behavior, etc. But a big issue with Skyrim is on the other side of the spectrum. The cities and the number of NPCs don't feel proportionate to what they are. Solitude, the capital of Skyrim, for all intents and purposes, has 62 inhabitants throughout a whole capital city. Does not feel immersive at all. I feel like Red Dead Redemption 2 actually breaks the paradigm in a way, which is crazy. Don't get me wrong, there are those strange, nameless filler NPCs, which makes sense to have. They don't explicitly feel nameless filler. They at least have some sort of normal lives and stuff they're going throughout the city. It doesn't feel like if I turn around or if I follow a specific NPC all day, they're just going to disappear into the void. For example's sake, I'll talk about the fake blind beggar in Saint-Denis because I think it's a good example. Even though it is a dynamic event, he's still not a central important named NPC. Those who don't know what I'm talking about, there is a beggar in Saint-Denis who begs for money. He has a blindfold over his eyes. If you pressure him, he starts to show a little sign of not being entirely honest. If you try and steal his money before you can get your hand into his hat, he gasps and moves his hat away and pretends not to notice you were trying to take his money. If you for some reason aim your gun at him, he freaks out, revealing he's a fake. This might completely turn out differently for different people. If you might have just ignored him or maybe tried to give him some money and did not notice the signs, some may have tried to steal the money, and some may have just aimed the gun at him. It's a very interesting situation that can really change and evolve depending on how you navigate it. And this is just one NPC that, even though is a random event, so people might be more drawn to it, it still shows the care and might instill into the player a mindset for paying more attention to filler or less important NPCs around. So we've talked a bit about the world and how it immerses you, and things that are really tertiary, meaning that they aren't the core gameplay experience. They complement it. That begs the question, what the actual general gameplay looks like for Red Dead Redemption 2. This is mostly what the next few sections are going to be, breaking down largely the core aspects in detail. But before we really get into each aspect of gameplay that Red Dead Redemption 2 has to offer, I do want to give some top level thoughts about how it all comes together. To put it simply, I think the gameplay is nothing short of masterclass. I don't know what it was that really made it click for me in the first chapter. There is of course the complaints that some say of its beginning being, but the first time you actually get into a shootout and transition from that slow walk through the snow to that immediate adrenaline rush in getting your revolver out, taking out the enemies in the area, from that point on it was all in. With its different gameplay aspects, it really gives you the feeling that you're living in a western. You could really be righteous, you could be an outlaw. Want to go hunting? Go ahead. Want to go fishing? Go ahead. Want to go find special breeds of horses, rob unsuspecting travelers on the road? Want to be an absolute scourge and menace to the townsfolk? This game tells you to go ahead, all of the above and more, combining all the gameplay aspects in the following sections to craft the experience. So on to the combat and gunplay. It is of course a core aspect of gameplay. Of course, as an outlaw, you'll have access to many different types of guns, from obviously revolvers and pistols, but also different types of shotguns, rifles, repeaters, etc. Each gun does have its own distinct feel to it that really made them stand out, and it was cool to unlock each one, test it out for a bit, see if I liked it or not, then go back to keep my old guns or keep it in the rotation. Our personal favorites were the Lancaster repeater, the dual wielding M1899s, and the pump action shotgun along with the bolt action rifle. Once I unlocked the majority of the guns, that was the kind of rotation that I went with. Of course, we're going to some others when either I was curious or wanted to feel for them, or if the situation demanded it. I think it was especially important for Rockstar to get this aspect of the gameplay right, and of course they did wonderfully with it. Starting with the basics, you have 3 really important resources that affect you and are on your screen at all times: your health, stamina, and deadeye meters. The circle around them represents how much you have of the given resource. The middle represents the cores, which I found a really interesting way of handling this, because what happens to your cores is your cores will naturally heal and regain back your meters over time, and your cores themselves will deplete slowly over time, and depending on the conditions you're in, they'll deplete slowly or they'll deplete quickly. This can really be an issue with health in particular, as if you run out of your meters and your health core is low or even completely empty, you will die once your meter is empty. Of your health core, you can barely survive on that, as many of you would have known or guessed perhaps. Beyond that, you have other effects that take place when your other 2 cores are empty as well. For example, your deadeye core being empty will actually affect your aim, make you wobbly. I actually didn't know this during me playing, but while researching, it apparently does do that. And another special thing about the deadeye meter is it doesn't replenish naturally when just standing around like the other 2. From my understanding, the deadeye meter only regenerates when getting kills, and the amount that is then generated then depends on a number of factors depending on the deadeye core's level to the kill itself. Finally, the stamina core when low will essentially make you tired, not as effective, and if your stamina meter isn't already drained, then it would start being drained more by actions that wouldn't usually drain it as quickly, such as climbing, running, etc. And the issue is when both the stamina meter and the stamina core are empty, then health implications take place, which basically mean instead of using your stamina, your actions will come out of your health meter. In short, I really like the way how the game handles this resource management, which ultimately is connected to the way you choose to play. Stuff like you not sleeping and not eating can easily be things that cut into your resources in such a way. Being in a hot area, cold area, and not being prepared with the appropriate attire can also have a similar effect. So moving on from resources and more into combat itself, Red Dead Redemption 2 uses a variety of combat systems that really influence your experience of the combat. In some other games, it feels like there's certain parts of the combat system you're never really engaging with. Whether you like it or not, Red Dead Redemption 2 integrates each combat system into really forcing you to understand each one on at least some level. What I mean is the combat system will give you stuff such as cover, different levels of damage you can inflict. I would say is an impressive system unto itself. Of course, we mentioned Deadeye earlier, and even the different ammo for each gun could constitute a decently complex system, and I'd like to go into each one of these systems and really explain how they make the combat come together into what it is. Starting with even just the choice of the different ammo in the game adds a layer of strategy and complexity to each gun and how you like to use them in different encounters. First of all, going through the different types of ammo such as high velocity, express, split point and explosive, they each obviously have just the base aspects of them, like one does more damage. There's also little things that you might not notice at first. High velocity, if you've got everything lined up, can kill or at least wound multiple enemies with just a single bullet. Express is really strong in terms of damage. Split point is good for accuracy and uses less deadeye meter than other bullets. Now, is this something that you're always going to have to be flicking through and having to manage? No, it's not in reality, which is good because I feel like it could get really annoying quickly. But it is useful to know and understand what each one of these ammo types does, and the game does allow you to engage with them so you can kind of tailor your combat encounters. For example, split point you could decide to use for more sniping or long distance encounters when you're picking off enemies from far away. Express you can just decide to use in general close encounters, and yes, in reality you can really just get by the whole game and not even knowing you could change ammo from regular. It's really up to you how you engage with it, and that's something I really love too. The more you give the game, the more it'll give back. I do want to add this, that it's not like certain ammo will just not work on enemies. All ammo is good ammo, right? It's not like in certain games there you have like this ammo for this enemy, this ammo for this enemy. It's not like that. A bullet is a bullet, right? But it's just if you want to have kind of tailor your experience some more, it's an extra layer. Another system in combat that I want to talk about is of course the cover system. Now, if you've played third person shooters, you know what I mean by cover, but if you haven't or you just want a quick reminder, it's essentially in the name. Taking cover meaning going behind a rock, ledge, wall, using it to protect yourself and giving yourself a good place to both shoot and not get picked off as easily. That's essentially the basic idea behind it. Of course, there is some more to it, like what type of cover you're using, enemy position, etc. And one thing I do want to say, this part can be kind of iffy depending on how you want to see it, because it does feel a bit slow and sometimes it can be a bit wonky to get right, because you cover and then you don't go to a place where you're actually planning to cover, because so much of the objects in this game can be used as cover. I do kind of want to mainly talk about it being a system that keeps close combat interesting. To be clear, I'm not trying to say that cover is some new novel idea that Red Dead Redemption 2 came up with. Of course, it's been in gaming for a better part of a few decades now. I feel like some may disagree, but I think Red Dead Redemption 2 has an interesting way that it uses it, of how the enemies use cover and you have to adapt to the feeling of like snapping out of cover, using Deadeye, taking out a whole group of enemies. I feel like Red Dead Redemption 2's cover does place a lot more on immersion than efficiency in a lot of ways. What I mean is that it isn't going to be something like where you snap from one predefined cover to another, snap from cover to cover again and again, is in like 2 seconds. It feels more weighty. You have a lot of decisions, as we spoke about. There's different types of cover. Pretty much anything, as I said before, can be used as cover. It comes to the territory of vulnerable and even most destructive cover. What I mean is that you can hide behind a crate and use it as cover, and then you'll immediately start thinking about, depending on the encounter, if it's just one enemy, you might be fine to just stay there, but if you have a group of enemies all trying to get to you, flank you, or much more likely destroy the crate that you're hiding behind, you need to start thinking about where else you will need to move. How long will it take to get from here to there? Will there be issues in that cover too? Is it even worth it? Can you just take out all enemies in one Deadeye, etc.? These are all essentially things that go under the radar for a lot of players, or might just go unappreciated. Of course, the game doesn't demand too much from you in terms of giving you some really intense type of encounter where you really have to think about all of this actively. But instead, you just go through it from intuition, to the point that it's the immersion that kind of leads to that more passive or implicit strategizing in encounters. Now, I've mentioned Deadeye briefly a few times with the cause and with cover as well just now. So some might be asking, well, what is Deadeye, or how does it come into play with the actual combat? So I would describe Deadeye as a mode or a sort of ability that you have where everything slows down and you have the opportunity to really just have a lot of fun. You can load up shots on different enemies in Deadeye. So I can have it where I activate Deadeye, aim 2 bullets for one person, 1 for another 2 people, etc. depending on what weapon it is. Some have fewer bullets that you can shoot in a single Deadeye activation at once. So some will use more of the Deadeye meter, I believe. Maybe I'm not describing it too well, but it really adds a lot to that satisfaction. There really isn't anything like coming across a group of bounty hunters dual wielding those M1899s and using Deadeye and just completely eviscerating them before they even realize you're there. Now, there's different levels to Deadeye, but I'll get into that more into the progression system. How you use Deadeye is up to you. You can use it exclusively as a way to engage with enemies, just keep refilling the bar and the core, and you'll be able to do that from my understanding. Or you could just just go on the other extreme and rarely use it, and maybe use it as like a last resort if an enemy's up close and you can't do anything else. Or like most players, just kind of be in the middle, use it sometimes, but it's really one of those tools that can create some cinematic, satisfying moments for the player. To finish up this part, I did want to talk about and mention the different levels of damage and how it really adds to the combat. What do I mean by different levels of damage? I mean, when you hit someone, it's not like you just hit them and it's like a bar of health that goes down and they aren't affected in any other way. It's more than that. 100%, you know what I mean by in some other games, fight an enemy, you just keep shooting and shooting and shooting. Nothing visually is happening to them, and then suddenly they flop over and die when their health bar is empty. Red Dead Redemption 2 is not like this at all. It may of course take more than one bullet to ultimately finish the job, but it's not like you shooting the enemy isn't going to have an effect. A lot of guns obviously do this differently. Like shotguns, typically you use them and then you shoot someone in the head. A lot of times the head will just explode. You can shoot enemies in the hand to disarm them, you can shoot them in the legs to slow them down. Other effects to a character such as an enemy burning are also done well. You can't really do anything against a fire bottle being thrown at you or you being on fire, hence why they are limited or for a while to get. Talked about those aspects, and there's a few more I could go into, but you probably see the point I'm trying to get here, that all of these systems aren't only acting in a vacuum. All of these considerations and systems are really all taking place at once to heighten an ultimately good combat experience, make it more dynamic, which can really immerse the player at once. All the pieces are put into place. Now, to finish up combat, I did want to talk about both melee and the throwables as an interesting part of combat. In Red Dead Redemption 2 we have melee, which really comes in a few forms in terms of unarmed and armed combat, in terms of knives, machetes, axes, and even the lasso itself. Unarmed combat, as in fist fighting, is very simple but good. You can block, push, move, dodge, move around, all simple concepts, but the way it feels to get a punch to then knock someone out in a bar fight, it's all around a good addition to the combat system. Now, moving on to the melee armed combat as well. Now, what I think is the most important thing for a game like Red Dead Redemption 2, where melee isn't, let's be honest, the focus of the combat system, which would most likely be the gunplay. I think the most important thing is that each option doesn't feel like a reskinned version of the other. They should all have some sort of unique thing to each melee option, like different level of swing, damage, animation, etc. They all do this to a relatively good level. Of course, there is reskinned type of weapons, but at least the base of the different weapons are distinct in range, damage, and uses, etc. Now, on to throwables. This is obviously a more centrally involved part of the combat system. What do I mean by that? Is it's actually pretty rare for you to actually go out and do armed melee combat, barring a few specific times in like sneaking missions, etc. Throwables are more centrally involved in the combat system because naturally you won't always be next to the enemy. Now, the different types of throwables I think were good and distinct, like dynamite, fireballs, etc. were more unique because what they do. That's not to put throwing knives and tomahawks down. I liked them, but there's only a few funny creative situations where I would actually use them over just shooting a pistol or revolver. Now, onto customization and progression. What we'll be looking at here is the way you can customize Arthur and essentially how you can progress from the beginning and leveling up certain skills, etc. There's a wide variety of clothing that you as Arthur can wear. Some for just style and look, some actually have benefits that you'd need to go out and hunt to actually make. As we said before, certain clothes are more suited to hot and cold temperatures. As I was saying in the combat section, there's a lot of customization you can do with guns and really personalizing them, different metals, colors, engravings, symbols, etc. on top of the actual combat improvements you can make from upgrading your guns. Combat improvements, however, aren't too much of a difference. It's not like you need to explicitly upgrade each gun every few missions. It's mostly like for small things like barrel length, rifling, etc. and make them feel a bit better to use, but not a like damage huge multiplier. Onto more of the progression in terms of leveling up your different attributes, health and stamina, etc. And most interestingly, Deadeye. While health and stamina just basically do what you'd assume they would, leveling up Deadeye actually improves your Deadeye at each level, from being able to see vital organs to manual targeting, as Deadeye starts as something where you have to auto-target. To be honest with you, I didn't know how you actually leveled this stuff up. I just kept it ticking over time during my time playing, but apparently relevant actions can help increase attributes like swimming, running, completing challenges, etc. But I don't know how true that actually is, since it's just something I didn't deliberately go out and try to do, if that makes sense. It just leveled up over time. Another thing I wanted to talk about was talismans and trinkets, which you could say act as a different kind of progression, but I'd still consider them relevant in this section. Now these essentially act as rewards in a lot of cases for either exploration or hunting or even side missions in other cases. What they basically give is permanent boosts to Arthur, such increasing your XP gain for an attribute, decreasing your attribute's drain speed, or other small effects like that. By nature of them being essentially permanent boosts, they're still nice no matter how minor they are. You don't have to equip them. As long as you have them crafted or found, the effect will be in place. Now onto a pretty unique system in terms of the honor system. Now I probably should have said this earlier, but I did do a high honor playthrough for my playthrough. I'm going to talk in the perspective of me doing that and going through that type of playthrough. Now while reputation systems and the like have existed in games for many years now, Fallout 3 for example had the karma system, which follows the same lines as the honor system, but ultimately I think they have a lot of differences as well. Fallout 3 you have bad and good karma, but it very rarely affected things beyond the companions you can have, some small interactions, etc. When it comes to Fallout 3, I think what really changes your experience on a bad karma playthrough in comparison to a good karma playthrough is what you did to get the bad karma. Like for example, if you chose to blow up Megaton and then you reset your karma to even good, you still nuked Megaton, so the choice still lingers. However, when I think it comes to Red Dead Redemption 2, the honor system is in a completely different context. You are Arthur. It's who Arthur ultimately chooses to be that is determined by your honor. There is some things that are special if you have high or low honor, like a discount in stores with high honor, more loot from dead bodies with low honor, but it's really about how Arthur changes in the cutscenes or as a character is why you would choose high honor or low honor. It's less about what you did to get that high or low honor, although it may have lingering effects. It's more about what your honor does in terms of Arthur's role in the story. A completely changed, considering man who's lived a life full of regret, or is Arthur more of a selfish, greedy, apathetic person to the world, ultimately in it for himself more than anything else? This also translates to your ending as well, but even just how Arthur talks to people and is perceived by and remembered by people. As I said, I haven't done a low honor playthrough, but I'm honestly interested in how some of the story moments were different or tweaked, or just moments, even side missions or random encounters play out on a low honor playthrough in comparison to a high honor, especially chapter 6. Now this is a very important aspect of the game, your horse and general traversal throughout the map. Now as I said, this game was special to me for the fact that probably the first game I would ever say ever got me not to want to fast travel. Fast travel is an option, don't get me wrong, in different methods and types, like the trains, stagecoaches, and even the camp has an upgrade to allow you to fast travel from it. But the actual genuine traversal and riding horseback through the different areas, never knowing what might happen, maybe you'll come across a new side mission, a new hidden area, a new dynamic event, a counter, etc. It was always something that was really useful in terms of the time it takes you to get to different locations. It didn't take obsessively or crazily long to get from location to location, but it definitely gave some time to think about and ponder the events in the story, digest it a bit before going and ahead and proceeding. It's something small, but it did really make a difference for me in a lot of the parts of the story because I had that passing of time and time to process those events, if that makes sense. Now on to most important part of the traversal is your horse. Your horse is an essential part of the game. There's a crazy amount of complexity that really makes it something you're really going to want to focus on throughout the game. What horse you have, are you taking care of your horse, etc. To tell you the truth, I didn't fully explore everything when it came down to this, but I can generally say that with everything put together, it's definitely a sizable aspect of the game. To speak in more detail, there's multiple ways of first obtaining a horse, from purchasing one to going out and essentially taming one, of course stealing one. Once obtained, however, you obviously need to make it your main horse by placing a saddle on it. What this does is allow you to use weapons that are currently unequipped or you don't explicitly have on your horse. There comes a point of you needing to bond with your horse, essentially meaning you use it, take care of it, and what will happen over time is that you will level up your bond, I believe the max being bond level 4. See, essentially a horse might not trust you or it might knock you off, you are going to put it into danger. Increasing your bond level will make it less likely for it to do that. Also, increasing your bond unlocks some abilities for the horse to do, like abruptly stop in its tracks, drift, etc. And when it comes to how you take care of it, you obviously need to feed it, brush it to keep it clean. Stuff like this will help increase its bond with you on top of just actually riding the horse around. Now from my understanding, there's like 19 or 20 different horse breeds for the game, just differentiating on stats, personality, feel and size. When it comes to different coats and looks for the horses, there's way more than that, with some being more rare and expensive than others. Now for what I went with, I started with a Morgan, of course, and then I got a Kentucky Saddler. I used the Shire for a bit, ultimately went out and tamed a White Arabian I essentially used for the majority of the game. Now your horse can die, which you can get into that predicament a lot if you're not careful. Essentially, if it gets knocked down, you can still save it if you have horse reviver, but if you don't and you can't reasonably get it, or if you die yourself, your horse will die and you will need to find a new one. Now when it comes to customization of horses, this is where I have to admit, didn't really engage with this too much at all, so I can't really speak to it, but from what I could see, you can customize your saddle, its hair, make it feel more personalized beyond what I've already said. Now onto the side activities you can engage with, quite a lot of them, and I would say I've kind of broke up the larger ones into the next few sections to finish up part 1 of this review. Just give my general thoughts on the side activities. I think they were good, obviously depending on which specific activity we're talking about, because we're talking about playing cards to side missions to watching plays to robbing trains, etc. There's an extremely large variety of things you can do in this game that I think you can't really do justice to it all by just describing them in a video. There's something special about the experience of just going around, not knowing anything, not knowing what you're going to decide to do, from just fishing, relaxing, to going into a shootout, to robbing stagecoaches, to shutting down an illicit business and robbing them. And some of that is just the stuff that is obvious and evident, but there is some side activities that just come about by you being in the right area at the right time, such as a side mission, stranger mission, or just exploration, hunting down legendary animals. Give an example of something that isn't exactly a side mission or exploration, but it's the serial killer hints. And this is an example of what I'm talking about by you don't know what you're going to find in a certain day of playing. So throughout my playthrough, I found these very grisly and gruesome sites where clearly a psychotic and dangerous killer had been. People who have played the game probably know what I'm talking about. You can find these sites and each one has a clue to where the killer is. He's leaving map pieces at each one and kind of taunting those who come across them to come and find him. I chose to organically find and didn't search up where each one was. I think I started this in chapter 2 and I finished it in chapter 4, and as a result, because I chose to come across these sites where he'd left clue naturally, it felt more like a narrative unfolding as I was playing, if that made sense. One side activity I do want to highlight in this section as kind of a favorite of mine, and that is bounty hunting. So essentially you go out and you go to a sheriff's office, you get a bounty poster. Depending on what it is, there'll either be a capture, alive only, dead or alive. I like these little like side stories. You go out and either have to trick, kill, capture, and then you do get a decent amount of money for it too. So in terms of side missions specifically, quite a few in variety that I would at least distinguish between. There's of course the stranger missions, which are the white marker with the question mark. These can range from one-time quick missions to full-on whole side storylines that of course have rewards and interesting and compelling stories. Not just like bland NPC-like characters, if you get what I mean. They're actually pretty interesting characters in these storylines. I'll just give a few of these stranger missions. First one I want to talk about is an early one, legendary gunslinger's mission called The Noblest of Men and a Woman, which essentially sees you going around to these legendary gunslingers to interview them about this one gunslinger called Jim Boy Calloway, as the mission giver is having a lot of difficulties in interviewing the man himself on account of a few things. Naturally, this idea of getting these legendary gunslingers to interview about Calloway doesn't exactly go to plan most of the time. I really like this storyline. It is one of the earliest you can find. It does go across chapters, and I believe it has to end in chapter 6 because the last duel unlocks then. It's also quite a simple mission in premise, but it's effective in what it tries to do. You essentially go across the whole map, from swamps to snow-covered peaks to plains, etc., and find these legendary gunslingers. Another example is the mission He's British, of course, which is a more comedic mission that you can find throughout the world. On the surface value, if you just look at the objectives of the mission without any context, you'll just probably guess that it's a fetch questy, copy-paste kind of mission, but it's actually quite the opposite. And what I wish games would do more of, if you're going to have these kind of simple objectives, you need to put something around it, add some interesting thing, or make it more interesting that adds flavor or memorability to it. That can be the characters, that can be the reward, substance of what you're doing beyond just the objectives, or a mystery, or a hook to make the player think. To kind of spoil the mission a bit, I thought it was just crazy how they modeled a whole line just for this mission, which might just be an unassuming mission for some people. You just find it out in the wilderness, and some British guy goes and asks you to get his exotic animals, a zebra, a tiger, and a lion. The first two animals are, as you would expect, painted to look like the animals in the world. So no, they aren't reskins trying to represent an animal. It is in universe that the zebra is just a painted mule and the tiger is a painted cougar. When it came to the lion, however, they actually completely modeled a unique lion that isn't used anywhere else in the game for a mission which you can just not do or miss. They put something in here to kind of catch the player's attention. Now personally, there is a gripe that I have with some types of side missions in general, in games as a whole. For example, I don't like missions which have something like go out and find 30 of X thing in the open world, no clues, nothing to guide you. Just look across the entire map to find them in some small missable corner. Now, if you like those types of missions, that's fine, but personally, I would prefer just not to do them. And there's a few missions like this in Red Dead Redemption 2, like the Totalosaurus mission, the rock carvings. I had no personal interest in going out and doing these missions. That's kind of it from the stranger missions aspect. I think a lot of them are great. They added flavor to the world. They did some good world building in terms of creating memorable characters and moments unique to each mission. Now, there is a small other type of mission I did want to talk about here, and that was the side missions to do with specific characters in the gang. I thought these were good in specifically fleshing out a lot of the more central characters and kind of getting to know them a bit more. I don't know if they're classed differently from stranger missions in particular, but I did want to talk about them in a separated kind of way. Missions with the likes of Javier, Sean, Lenny, Uncle, Tilly, Kieran, etc. It really allows you to connect more of these secondary and tertiary characters in the gang, but it's not in some throwaway manner. The story to this game is already long enough. If they try to infuse more of these kind of companion missions into the main story, it could ruin the pacing of the game. These really got me to see what each of these characters' personality was like. That kind of father-son or maybe uncle-nephew is more close connection that Lenny and Arthur have, that you see in the main story a bit. It was more apparent to me when you did the companion missions with him. For example, Lenny's naivety when it comes to situations got me to understand he's still 19, still very much a kid to the rest of the gang where he stands. Javier was another character I really liked because of the companion missions that I got to do with him. He has that cool kind of demeanor that shines through how much of like a good friend he is. It was really made more obvious with these companion missions. There's more to say in terms of specific characters and how these companion missions really added to that, but I think I'll save that for part 2. Another side activity that you could obviously engage with would have to be the exploration. We've kind of talked about this in a decent amount of detail, and this video is already as long as it is for a part 1, so I don't really want to repeat myself with old stuff about dynamic events, random encounters, apart from them being a really good incentive to actually go out and explore. You see, it's the structure of Red Dead Redemption's world that is really interesting to me, because in the category of open world games, there's multiple types of open worlds. There's go to one location, then go to another, and then never return to the old locations, and then there's that older location is just kind of forgotten or left in a limbo after it's being completed, if you know the style I'm talking about. Red Dead Redemption 2 doesn't have this style of world. How I would describe it, the world of Red Dead Redemption 2 is it's more dynamic in its nature, and it sees you going to the older towns and the other towns and cities, or at least passing through them enough that you would be able to engage with what may be new there. In terms of exploration of the actual world, I think there was some interesting side locations, not even tied to a mission, that you could just go out and find, like Aberdeen Pig Farm is one such location, which I found interesting because it was pointed out by a random encounter with a stranger who told me to avoid it. Naturally, I checked it out and it's pretty interesting. There's other smaller side locations which have some interesting things there, like Witch's Cauldron, the Meteor Site, the Abomination House, the other little shacks you can find around. You might even find something literally in the middle of the forest that you were completely not expecting. One last thing to kind of wrap this section up, as I said, I don't want to retread too much, but the level of confidence that Rockstar had in this world is astonishing. You can really tell the difference between a game that wants you to fall in love with its world and a game who knows you'll fall in love with its world, if that makes sense. They never actually force you to go out and explore or engage with anything in the world more than going back and forth. In another game, perhaps the devs would be scared to take an approach like this. They might justify making their own content by forcing you to at least look at it. In Red Dead Redemption 2, there's things that I didn't even know even after playing 100 hours of the game. It's that level of confidence that I have to mention in this section because it's not something you see every day. It just shows the caliber of a studio and the love for the game that they've labored to make. The final section of this part of the review before the conclusion, I do want to talk about both the hunting and the fishing as a side aspect, because I do think a core part of the game that you should at least engage with a bit, not for the enjoyment of it, but more the benefits of doing them. So obviously hunting and fishing, as I said, is an aspect of the game that is out there. I personally prefer the hunting to the fishing, but there is that calm of fishing, at least. If you're not trying to catch a legendary fish, then you'll know true hell. But besides that, to start off, I want to talk about fishing first, because it is a smaller aspect in terms of need to engage with. You don't need to fish. It's a part of the game that exists for people who want to do it, but that doesn't mean it's some badly forgotten done system in the corner that no one engages with. I think the way they introduce it to you as a system is actually pretty good in the story. Essentially, you can go around to different swamps, lakes, rivers to catch different fish of different types, sizes, etc. Obviously, there's the consumable benefit here where you can just go and catch fish pretty easily, at least catch a few, have some food, and you're stuck up with. Essentially can act as that break activity. Red Dead Redemption 2 has quite a lot of these, like the mini games like poker and blackjack. These are not directly tied to your life as an outlaw or fighting or capturing enemies, but it's just something relaxing that you can go and do to get a break from the chaos of 1899 America. When it actually comes down to the mechanics of fishing, there's definitely some complexity here, from using different lures, bait, etc. that you can get when it comes to actually reeling in and catching the fish? Do you want to be more risky but a bit quicker to catch the fish itself? Because you can snap the line, which isn't a very nice experience. You lose the fish, of course, which it can be frustrating if you're trying to catch a legendary fish, which can take a few minutes each attempt and are more demanding from you, where you're most likely going to try some of these techniques to catch the fish quicker. You also lose any bait or lure that you had attached to the line when you snapped it, which is low stakes, but it's still kind of a calming activity. You could easily lose hours just fishing if you wanted to, but personally, it wasn't something I did too often in the game by choice. I did it whenever a side mission or a main mission wanted me to. I never really found myself forcing myself to just, here's a fishing place, let me go ahead and fish for a bit. Hunting is another aspect I wanted to discuss in this section a bit more, because I engage with it a lot more, and I feel like it's something that everyone who plays the game should engage with, if not for the enjoyment of it, but the gameplay benefit of doing it, as I said earlier. First thing I want to talk about, of course, is hunting of the animals themselves, going out, perhaps finding or perhaps coming across different animals to which then hunt. So for me, the actual act of hunting is just something I did spontaneously. I wouldn't go out as much to specifically hunt a type of animal. If I needed to hunt, I would. If I just felt like it, I would. Now, when it comes to how you hunt, you really need to think about what weapon you use. There are specific weapons more suited to hunting animals than actual combat, like the varmint rifle, which is focused on hunting smaller animals. Rifles are more suited in general to hunting animals. Specifically, the Springfield rifle I found was a really useful weapon in hunting medium to larger animals. Of course, there's always the bow, which I ended up near the end really liking, especially using Deadeye in the later parts of the game. The reason why you want to think about what weapon you use is the pelt can very easily become damaged if you're not careful about what weapon you use. You would want to get a really clean kill when it comes to hunting, aiming for the vitals with Deadeye, like the heart, to do the least amount of damage to the pelt as possible. Of course, using weaker weapons that require more bullets, like revolvers in some case, or using an overkill weapon like a shotgun will completely degrade the pelt once it comes to collecting them. This is important because the quality of the pelt actually decides what you can do with the pelt. For example, it could decide how much pelt would go ahead and sell for, or if you could even use it to craft some special clothes at the trapper, which you'll need perfect pelts in a lot of cases, if not all of them, to craft some of these clothes, accessories, etc. There's also the aspect, why would you hunt to begin with, and why would I recommend hunting at least to a degree in the game? And that reason is it's a very good way to max out all your cores. Just kill a few deer, cook up the big game meat, and you're good for a few hours of playtime. When it comes to food, to max out all your cores, obviously there's other stuff like tonic, etc. Hunting is still a very good way to collecting essentially large quantities of food for you just in case. Now, I do want to talk about the legendary animals because they are very important, more so than the legendary fish in my opinion, because they are more unique and interesting. There's an added aspect here which is present in hunting as a whole, but it's really crucial when trying to hunt down the legendary animals, and that is eagle eye. Now, this essentially allows you to track down different animals' paths through their footprints. This is present throughout the whole game, but to be honest, I never focused on using it but on stuff like legendary animals. Now, why hunt legendary animals? Apart from the actual hunt itself and the more unique versions of different animals, some are more unique than others, I'll say that. There is the same monetary incentive here. It's a good source of early money in the game that is just there. There's also the fact that you can get different outfits and clothes made out of these pelts, like if you were to get perfect pelts. To kind of wrap up this part of the review quickly, since this isn't the full final review's conclusion, that will come in the part 2 of this Twittery Classics. This part, of course, focused on the gameplay aspects, the next part focusing on the story aspects. I do want to give a score to the gameplay aspects, and it will surprise you. So overall, is Red Dead Redemption 2 worth it from the gameplay standpoint? Yes. I didn't want to talk about everything in this half, even to do with the gameplay. It would kind of be redundant for me to talk about certain things or try to separate them out even more. Like, I could have had a section on minigames. I wanted to talk about the game as a whole in a more detailed way, but not in a completely showing people everything that exists in the game. Even I don't know that. Now onto the score for the gameplay. Before I get into that, for those who are first time here, I do want to mention the general way I do review scores, because it will differ from other reviewers and how they give scores. I don't have the belief that you can really give a universal score that all games can be rated by. I choose to give a score to games that are or will be a part of a franchise or series of games, and the score will be in context of that series of games and how well it ultimately fills its potential. For example, I might give Dark Souls 1 9.3, and I might give Dark Souls 2 a 7.1 or something, but that doesn't mean Dark Souls 2 is a 7 in comparison to other games. It's just in comparison to how I believe it fulfills its full potential. Of course, this is all subjective and you can disagree, but ultimately it's how I like to review things. Now, I very rarely do this, but for the score of the gameplay and experience of Red Dead Redemption 2, it is a 10 out of 10. If I were to be really rigid here, I could say 9.9 because there was some aspects in an ideal world that could be handled better. To clarify, the score relates to the context of the series and the game itself. Now, do I believe Rockstar physically could have done better with the game in a practical way, like they could have had a better gameplay experience? Is it something where in Red Dead Redemption 3, if they decide to make it, do I believe that they could do relatively better to Red Dead Redemption 2? To be honest, I could see them maybe matching Red Dead Redemption 2, but I don't know how you do better gameplay wise. Now, this doesn't mean, by the way, that the final score of Red Dead Redemption 2 is a 10 out of 10. This means that the gameplay experience, I think, is a 10 out of 10. There's some things like in the story that could drag it down a bit, and I do think there's some aspects that I'll get to that fall into that category of they could have done better here or there. That's it for this part of the review. Thank you everyone for watching to the end. This has been a really long review. I don't think this is my longest, but it will be interesting to see how long this is. I believe we're at 1.5 hours, but of course I'll try to get part 2 of this review out as soon as possible. And for people who are, just to give you guys an update, part 2 is already written, as in script wise. It's just I need to do recording and all that kind of stuff for it, and edit it and all that kind of stuff. It shouldn't be too long to get it out, but anyway guys, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. It's a huge help, more than you can understand. You know, helping out, subscribing, liking the videos, commenting, feedback, all this kind of stuff really helps me out, and thank you guys. See you in the next part or in the next video. Bye.